right. Hello, everybody, to a wonderful, wonderful stream on an excellent day. I am joined by a highly illustrious guest who really needs no introduction in our circles. But in any case, Mr. Prudentialist, how are you, sir?
I'm doing great, Mr. Mantrell. Happy to be here, and we're covering a really important book, so even all the more important to be here.
Indeed, indeed. As listeners of this book well know, it is rich with detail, and there's a reason why I wanted it to be covered. Of course, it's not a huge audience which comes to watch, but it's a very small and exceptionally dedicated audience, which is what I care about. So without further ado, can I make... Oh, yes, good. It looks like the screen is sharing here. That's excellent, so the audience can read along as we go through it. Yes, we are slowly upgraded this channel. I know we have not in past had actual screen footage when I've been going through this because I've just been using my hard copy. But Mr. Prudentialist has been so illustrious and so generous as to hook me up with a PDF version of this book, so I can actually have you read along with us. So, without further ado, we shall get into it. This is Chapter 12. It's called The Dragon Unleashed, The Rise of the Symbionese Liberation Army from November 1973 to February 1974. It begins with a quote from George Jackson in the book that we've mentioned earlier in previous chapters called Soledad Brother. And it goes like this. Believe me, my friend, with the time and the incentive that these brothers have to read, study, and think, you will find no class or category more aware, more embittered, desperate, or dedicated to the ultimate remedy, revolution. The most dedicated, the best of our kind, you will find them in the Folsoms, San Quentins, and Soledads. They live like there was no tomorrow. And of course, there's another quote from Ho Chi Minh here, which says, when the prison gates fly open, the real dragons will emerge. So, of course, this is where the title of the chapter comes from, and just goes to show you, well, if the best of your kind is in Folsom, San Quentin, and Soledad, what do you have to say about the best of your kind in general?
I'm ready to get into it when you are.
Okie doke. The death of Twyman Myers in 1973 should have signaled an end to what remained of the underground movement. The BLA had now been defeated. Only the Weather Underground soldiered on, a shadow of its former self, its isolated leadership groping for some kind of return to relevance. The 60s were over. America was moving on. With the war all but complete, underground violence seemed a relic of a fast receding era, vanishing as quickly as peace signs. In fact, the American underground was poised for an explosive rebirth, one that would spawn headlines unlike any seen before, along with a series of second-generation protest bombers. This new eruption of armed cells would be peopled by a motley collection of wannabes and never-weres, those who had missed the Weather and BLA trains or who saw in those organizations' exploits a path toward the greater meaning so many radicals sought once the seismic energies of the 1960s faded. They emerged in far-flung corners of the country, in the Bay Area, in the Pacific Northwest, in New England, and in New York. Most modeled themselves on Weather or the BLA, reading, rereading, and underlining their Mao and Debray and Marighella, even rediscovering the rigors of criticism, self-criticism. But what made the new cells distinct from their forerunners was that they no longer drew their inspiration from the war or the civil rights movement. Their intellectual fuel emanated instead from a new source of shimmering radical energy, U.S. prisons, especially those in California. That jailed criminals would link up with the underground movement had long been foreseen. The rhetoric of violent revolution had found hundreds, perhaps thousands, of eager adherents in U.S. prisons from its first utterances in the mid-60s. Nowhere did prisoners pore over Debray and Che and Marighella more avidly than in California, where their interest attracted the notice of those who wanted a revolution just as badly. White radicals in San Francisco, Oakland, and especially the college city of Berkeley. This unlikely alliance between charismatic black inmates and adoring white radicals provided the underground with the long-sought messiah it ardently sought, thereby prolonging the life of a movement that had been on its last legs. Well, this just goes to show you, as we've mentioned before, the actual revolution doesn't stop once reform is achieved. It actually continues and expands and gets worse. Ironically, the figure who paved the way for all of this was a white man, Carl Chessman. Sorry, his name's got an odd spelling here. A convicted rapist who, during the 1950s, launched a tireless legal and literary assault on the California prison system from his cell at San Quentin. What began as a stream of writs and lawsuits evolved into a series of best-selling memoirs in which Chessman put the prison system's brutality on trial. By the time he was finally executed in 1960, he had drawn clemency appeals from such liberal icons as Eleanor Roosevelt and Norman Mailer. During the 1960s, hundreds of California inmates mimicked Chessman's tactics, churning out thousands of clemency petitions and memoirs of their own. So many that as late as 1967, inmates on San Quentin's death row were punished if discovered attempting to write their life stories. Few snatched up Chessman's gauntlet more skillfully than the first important group of post-war prison radicals, the Black Muslims, whose leader, Elijah Muhammad, himself a one-time convict, had begun recruiting convicts during the 1950s. Malcolm X preached that prisoners held a special place in the Black Muslim world, symbolizing white society's crime of keeping black men oppressed and deprived and ignorant and unable to get decent jobs, turning them into criminals.
Notice how the rhetoric has not changed in 60, 70 years with relation to white oppression narratives with respects to like black liberation. It's all the same, and even to this day, if you talk about crime with any white Democrat, most of the time you're going to hear something very similar to what Malcolm X is talking about.
Yes. It's never their fault. It's always society's fault. It's always some wrong of society. Yeah, it's always all the same thing. But that just goes to show you, this is why I wanted to display this text to people so much, because the rhetoric has not changed in 60 years at all. It's the same processes, the same thing over and over again. But anyway, let us continue. By the early 1960s, there were mosques at several California prisons, including San Quentin, Folsom, and Soledad. The wardens tried to outlaw their meetings, leading to an escalating series of confrontations that climaxed with shootings that killed Muslim inmates in 1961 and again in 1963. By 1967, after a bloody riot at San Quentin, California prison facilities had embarked on a cycle of violence and retaliatory crackdowns that would endure for years. It brought racial polarization, along with an avalanche of legal challenges and, among black inmates at least, racial unity and a taste for open confrontation with guards and wardens. The first inmate to emerge as a public figure from this turmoil, Eldridge Cleaver, as we have seen, almost single-handedly rallied white radicals to the prison reform movement, and, in doing so, built the foundation of the Black Inmate White Radical Alliance that ensued. By 1970, the protests of Bay Area radicals were all but permanent fixtures outside the walls of San Quentin. For apocalyptic revolutionaries who had long sought a constituency to rise up and fight alongside them, black inmates seemed to represent the Holy Grail. Weathermen, after all, had invested thousands of hours attempting to rally working-class youth, high school students, and black liberals, and had earned little in return but snickers and shrugs. Finally, in California's toughest prisons, radicals found what appeared to be a loyal following. By 1968, black inmates were reported to be forming clandestine chapters of the Black Panthers and a hardcore Marxist group called the Black Guerrilla Family, both of which operated extensive, secret Marxist political education groups, including courses on revolutionary theory and bomb-making. In 1971, a House subcommittee identified the most popular books requested by black inmates as The Autobiography of Malcolm X, H. Rap Brown's Die Nigger Die, that is with a hard R, and Cleaver's Soul on Ice. It was Cleaver, starting in 1968, who loudly and repeatedly began predicting that black inmates would soon rise up and form the leading edge of the revolution. This kind of talk produced something approaching rapture in a certain brand of white revolutionary, to the point that, in a phenomenon the author Eric Cummins terms convict cultism, by the early 1970s, convicts who were released from California prisons frequently enjoyed instant hero status in radical organizations. As a movement radical named Betsy Carr put it, I was completely fascinated with black inmates. The glamour, the bizarreness. It was my Hollywood. I never discussed anything with any of them, just watched in total awe. By 1971, scores of Bay Area radicals were volunteering and protesting at California prisons. More than a few of the black inmates they befriended, however, turned out to be opportunists who parroted Marxist philosophy in hopes of luring their new white friends into helping them make parole, or in extreme cases, escape. The classic case came in October 1972, when several members of Venceremos, a leading Bay Area activist group, ambushed a car transporting a black prisoner named Ronald Beatty outside Chino's California Institute for Men. Isn't that a euphemistic name? Institute for Men.
I also find it funny just these. I'm reminded of Barack Obama, where he's like parroting, like I think he said he was like quoting Foucault and Marx in college, trying to get laid. Turns out it didn't really work for him, but I'm just noticing a similar pattern.
Well, we'll get to that. Yeah. A guard was killed in the ensuing gunfight. Their plan, authorities learned later, was to form guerrilla training camps in the California mountains, from which they would launch the long-awaited revolution in American cities. These hopes were dashed, however, when Beatty was recaptured. He not only implicated much of the Venceremos leadership, he also said he had only pretended to be a revolutionary to gain his freedom. For a brief window of time, between 1968 and 1972 or so, many in the movement's most radical corners ardently believed that black inmates held the key not only to the underground's future, but to the specter of revolution itself. All that remained was the emergence of someone to lead them. Ever since Cleaver fled to Algeria, white revolutionaries, especially in the Bay Area, had been seeking that new messiah, a strong man who could unite white radicals and black inmates in the revolution. In 1970, they found him, the fifth great voice of the era's black militants. His name was George Jackson. On paper, George Jackson resembled Eldridge Cleaver. Like Cleaver's, Jackson's family immigrated to Southern California during the 50s. There, like Cleaver, he became a teenage thug who stole cars, robbed liquor stores, and wanted, deep in his soul, to someday become a writer. But whereas Cleaver could grin and charm and talk for hours, Jackson was a thug with a fountain pen, far angrier and prone to violent language than Cleaver had ever been. Jackson was born in Chicago in 1941. His family moved to Watts in Los Angeles when he was 14. A gangbanger with a long criminal record, by his own admission, he staged his first mugging at the age of 12. After a burglary at 15, he was sentenced to a California, again with these euphemisms, California Youth Authority camp. He escaped and fled to Chicago, then got himself arrested after knifing a man and was dragged back to Los Angeles in shackles. He escaped again. He was recaptured again. Paroled, he was arrested in 1961 for a $70 gas station stick-up in Bakersfield. When he pled guilty, the judge gave him a sentence of 1 year to life. On his prison admission form, Jackson stated that his ambition was to become a successful writer. He was 19.
19 and all this being done. At a certain point, you just throw the book at him, or you just put him in the chair.
Yes. Well, that requires capital punishment, which he's not quite there at this point. George Jackson would spend his entire adult life behind the walls of California prisons. initially in a juvenile facility, then San Quentin, and later Soledad, a hulking fortress outside the farm town of Salinas, an hour south of San Francisco. He was an extraordinarily violent prisoner, earning 47 disciplinary actions in just under 10 years, an average of one every 10 weeks. At his first stop, he and his friend James Carr, best known for burning down his elementary school at the age of 9. Jesus fucking hell. Like, imagine being a 9-year-old and being driven to commit arson.
Seriously unwell people. Sick people, folks. Sick people.
Yeah, indeed. His best friend, James Carr, best known for burning down his elementary school at the age of 9, worked as muscle for Mexican gangs, then branched out into loan sharking and homosexual pimping. Jackson was investigated for a murder, as he would be several times, but nothing came of it. Transferred to San Quentin, Jackson, by then a chiseled 6-footer, it was said that he performed 1,000 fingertip push-ups every morning, joined the Black Capone gang, where he established himself as a feared debt collector, so adept at threatening other inmates that he took to buying debts from other prisoners to collect himself. He was angry, sullen, irascible, and legendarily mean-spirited. He was the meanest mother I ever saw, inside or out, a white prisoner once recalled. And you want to know why he was what dumbass people call a prison leader? Because everyone was shit scared of him. I mean, he was into everything when I was inside. Dope, booze, peddling ass, you name it. Strong arm, hitman. John Irwin, a board member of the United Prisoners Union. There's a United Prisoners Union?
Pretty sure. All public sector employees more or less have unions, especially in California. Can't say I'm surprised.
Oh, sorry. The way that it was phrased did make it sound like it was a jailers union.
No, like... fair. Well, maybe it is. Hold on. Now I'm looking it up. Oh no! So apparently, the original work of the UPU was a prisoners' rights advocacy group, organizing prisoners and ex-cons into labor unions that can make demands such as minimum wages. And this is according to the Freedom Archives, which is this huge digital search engine for radicals in the Bay Area. Okay, wow. Never mind. I was incorrect. No, these are just actual fucking all commie organizations. Just there you go.
Communist Front Org, yes. Anyway, as John Irwin says, we hated his guts. He was a mean, rotten son of a bitch. He was a bully. An unscrupulous bully. The stories of Jackson's prowess as a prison fighter, especially after he began studying martial arts, are legion. The time he was seen swinging a length of pipe during a riot in 1967. The times he took pals into the showers and, just for the fun of it, screamed, "Attack!" and began beating other inmates bloody. He was pound for pound the toughest guy I ever knew, an inmate named Johnny Spain recalled. No doubt, Johnny Spain, that sounds like a character in a shitty pulp novel. Like from a thriller novel or something.
They do exist in real life.
They do. I'm observing. No doubt part of Jackson's anger arose from his 1965 parole review, where his own father testified that his son was better off in prison. It was in the wake of this setback, during long months in solitary confinement, that Jackson began reading radical literature an older inmate gave him. Like a generation of black inmates from Malcolm X to Dhoruba Moore to Sekou Odinga, he discovered not only the power of the written word, but the revolutionary views espoused by Frantz Fanon, Malcolm, and Che. He began to see himself as a victim of white society, a viewpoint he developed at length in letters to his family. On January 13th, 1970, as Jeff Jones and Bernardine Dorn were settling into a San Francisco apartment 2 hours north, came the events that would transform George Jackson from an anonymous convict to the Bay Area left's messiah. Racial tensions were running high that day when Soledad officials released 15 black and white prisoners into a new exercise yard alongside the notorious O Wing, the prison's maximum security ward. A fistfight broke out. Standing above the yard, a white guard named O.G. Miller raised his carbine and, with no whistle being blown, no warning shots being fired, shot 4 bullets. All, an investigation showed later, were aimed at the black prisoners. A supervisor would freely admit that Miller had been trying to protect the whites. 3 black inmates fell dead. Oh, so you're saying that even in prison, people come down on the side of their own group. Even prison guards come down on the side of their own group. Even in riots. Fascinating. Immediately, talk of reprisal flashed through the black population, not just of Soledad, but of San Quentin, Folsom, and every other significant California prison. At Soledad, George Jackson's voice was among the loudest. Revenge among inmate gangs had always been the law. If a white prisoner killed a black, the blacks would retaliate, and vice versa. Jackson argued that this policy should now be extended to the guards. There had been talk going around for some time that the officers were subject to the same treatment that the inmates were getting, one inmate recalled. And I think there was kind of a concerted kind of thing going on to where one would be taken from all the institutions. It was a thing like when one prisoner gets knocked in Folsom, then one guard will go in Quentin, one will go in Soledad, and one will go in Tehachapi, all down the line. Meanwhile, a grand jury began reviewing the killings. On January 16th, after a television report that the grand jury had ruled the deaths justifiable homicide, the Soledad inmates took their revenge. A young, inexperienced guard named John Mills was alone on the floor of Soledad's Y Wing, where Jackson was housed. A group of inmates grabbed him by the throat, beat him up, and threw him over a third-floor railing. Mills struck the concrete floor below with a thud, tried to rise, then fell dead. The cell block exploded in cheers. Jackson and 2 other inmates were detained, placed in solitary, and charged with Mills' murder. As a serial offender, Jackson faced the gas chamber. The case of the Soledad brothers, as the 3 were very soon dubbed, would have a profound impact on the California prison system, the left, and ultimately the underground. The key figure was a radical attorney named Faye Stender, who agreed to represent Jackson after she made a name for herself as Huey Newton's co-counsel in his murder trial. A plain woman with a smoldering sexuality, Stender was utterly entranced by the black inmates she represented. Although married with 2 children, she would enter into a sexual relationship with Jackson, as she had with Newton. She was a genius at public relations. As she'd done with Newton, she intended to put the entire white system on trial by portraying Jackson as an innocent victim being persecuted for his revolutionary beliefs. Enlisting white activists from across California, Stender formed the Soledad Brothers Defense Committee, which soon blossomed into a full-blown bureaucracy with 7 subcommittees and a who's who of radical chic supporters, including Jane Fonda, Pete Seeger, Allen Ginsberg, Tom Hayden, and a striking UCLA professor named Angela Davis.
I've had the great displeasure of meeting her.
Have you really?
Yeah, when I was in college, she went on a speaking tour, and my comm professor was like, so let's go to this thing, you get extra credit. And just listening to her talk and relate to the system, yeah, this whole thing doesn't do it justice about how evil these people are.
Yes, yeah. You don't hate them enough, as your catchphrase frequently states. The committee turned Jackson into a cause célèbre for the radical left, pumping out a stream of posters, pamphlets, buttons, bumper stickers, and fundraising letters while staging bake sales, poetry readings, and art auctions. The Grateful Dead even played a benefit concert. Christopher Sandbach on Suicide Watch. Oh, man. I mean, it just goes to show you, like, like Angela Davis is still like teaching. She's still a professor.
Yeah, she still
Like
gives talks.
she still gives talks. These people all still exist. They all are still in the system. They've all received positions of prominence and authority. Moving
Yep.
on. Moving on. Under Stender's guidance, George Jackson emerged as the living symbol of everything the Bay Area left yearned for. Strong, black, prideful, masculine, and undeniably sexual. John Irwin, who was called to testify for Jackson's defense, noticed how naive and starstruck Stender and her supporters were. It was mostly women who were doing the organizing, he told the writer David Horowitz years later. They had handpicked their favorite Soledad brother and were kind of oohing and awing over them, like teenagers with movie stars. I couldn't believe it. A New York radical named Gregory Armstrong met Jackson and summarized his appeal this way. Everything about him is flashing and shining and glistening, and his body seems to ripple like a cat's. As he moves forward to take my hand, I literally feel myself being pulled into the vortex of his energy. There is no way I can look away. He gives me a sudden radiant smile of sheer sensual delight, the kind of smile you say for someone you really love. As we take each other's hands, I have a sense of becoming almost a part of his very physical being. This is like the gayest thing I can imagine.
Well, but I mean, again, 60 years. Well, I mean, there's always been I don't know if I can necessarily call it a universal. I don't think it is, but I mean, at least in America, there has always been this like strange, transgressive sexual fascination with like the outlaw. But I mean, like this is just weaponized to a T.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. This is incredibly weaponized. But I think it just, and this is yet another reason that. Oh, hold on, I just lost my place. There it is. That there's a reason why these people are the way that they are. Everybody has seen the heat maps of liberals versus conservatives and that sort of thing, in terms of in-group versus out-group preference. And I'm coming to this idea here of like the myth of the sacred Negro. Right. This is an idea I've been playing around with for a while in just my readings of this and seeing the left's behavior. And I don't think that this particular segment of the population group like was chosen for like unrational reasons. I think the reasons why this group was chosen is because, as they have said, it's like the perfect victim group for all of the correct reasons, and using this segment of the population as the stalking horse, if you will, or the radical vanguard, which does most of the actual like dirty work. Like there's a reason for that, and I think that that's an additional reason why the left considers these people so sacred.
Probably something to that. I mean, the more you read this literature, I mean, it's nothing more but just like a deep-seated affinity for the outgroup. I mean, besides just like the usual like in-group, out-group preferences, but I mean, it's just quantifiably sexualized, and again, in order to be part of it, one must let go of any sort of bond that they might have had beforehand.
Yeah. Well, just for the audience's awareness, I did try to see if I could perform an early life on Stender, this Faye Stender chick, and unfortunately she does not have a Wikipedia article that I could find. And Stender does not seem to be a name that is, even though it's German, it doesn't seem to be associated with a certain group. But anyway, that's just for your awareness. So this is ostensibly a white Gentile woman who is doing all of this here. Anyway, moving on. But Jackson's most valuable asset, as Faye Stender saw, was his writing. It was she who discovered the letters he had penned to family and friends and contacted Bantam Books about publishing them. Gregory Armstrong, in fact, was Jackson's editor there. He and Stender combed through Jackson's writings, editing them heavily. They chose, for instance, not to publish the letter in which Jackson fantasized about poisoning Chicago's water supply in an effort to portray him as an American Dreyfus. What is with these people and wanting to poison the water supply? Like, what? Why? What is with this obsession?
Well, for a variety of reasons, but also that poisoning the water system just makes it easier to kill more. And then they're trying to portray him as like the American Dreyfus, akin to the Dreyfus affair in France in the late 19th century.
Yeah. Well, there's questions about that affair too that maybe should be looked into. Anyway, Stender draped him in the trappings of an intellectual, giving him a set of horn-rimmed glasses and luring the French philosopher Jean Genet to write a preface for his book. It worked spectacularly. Published in October 1970, Soledad Brother, The Prison Letters of George Jackson was an immediate bestseller, a critical and commercial sensation. The New York Times called it one of the most significant and important documents since the first black was pushed off the ship at Jamestown Colony. Jeez. Soledad Brother made Jackson an international literary sensation, much as Soul on Ice did for Cleaver. But in the end, it brought little but heartache to Jackson himself. The first blow fell on his brother, Jonathan Jackson, a bright, sensitive student at Pasadena's Blair High School. Sensitive student, my ass. Jonathan,
a real scholar, I'm sure.
Yeah, they're always, he's a young scholar. It's always a scholar with these people. Jonathan became obsessed with the Soledad brothers' case. He regularly visited George and attended his hearings. George, in turn, assigned Jonathan to be Angela Davis's bodyguard. It was Angela who gave Jonathan his first gun, a .380 caliber Browning with a 13-round clip. That should say magazine, but okay. On August 5th, 1970, after a long visit with George, she bought him another, a shotgun, at a San Francisco pawn shop.
And if you know, good, they're going to do the whole Angela Davis case here, where, yeah, she's responsible for the murders here.
Literal terrorism, yes.
Yes.
Whether a conspiracy was afoot to help George escape from prison would never be proven. What is known for certain is that 2 mornings later, at 10:45 on August 7th, Jonathan walked into the Marin County Courthouse and took a seat at the rear of Judge Harold Haley's courtroom. In the dock were 3 of George's revolutionary friends, all San Quentin inmates. One, James McLean, was in the process of being retired for the stabbing of a guard. Retried. The other 2, Ruchel Magee and William Christmas, again with these fucking Pulp Fiction names, had been called as witnesses.
Christmas and Ruchel Magee.
Suddenly, I mean, even then they had weird freaking names, that like non-standard names. It's like Ruchel. There would be a hyphen in that name today, I think.
Probably.
Suddenly, Jonathan stood up, pulled a sawed-off shotgun from beneath his overcoat, and shouted, "All right, gentlemen, I'm taking over now." He produced several more guns and tossed them to Magee and McLean, then called Judge Haley forward and taped the shotgun to his chin. After several minutes of confusion, the 4 men took the judge, a prosecutor, and 3 women jurors as hostages and walked outside to a yellow van Jonathan had rented. A witness later said, McLean shouted, "Free or release the Soledad brothers by 12:30 or they all die." Several minutes ticked by when McLean couldn't figure out how to operate the van, and he and Jonathan were obliged to switch places. By that point, police and sheriff's deputies had surrounded the area. As Jonathan drove toward the frontage road, a shot rang out. In a flash, dozens of officers opened fire on the van. Jonathan, wounded, pulled the trigger on the shotgun, blowing off Judge Haley's face. By the time the shooting stopped, Jonathan, McLean, and Christmas were dead. Ruchel Magee and the prosecutor were badly wounded. Angela Davis was arrested in New York 2 months later and brought back to trial. She was eventually exonerated of all counts linked to the shootout, and emerged as a radical icon herself, and remained famous for years after the world had forgotten Jonathan Jackson. Jonathan, who was given a Black Panther funeral, became the radical left's newest martyr. More than one underground group would ultimately take his name as theirs. George Jackson spent the year after his brother's death writing the book that he believed would be his legacy. He never lived to see it published. On August 12, 1971, with his trial already underway, someone, almost certainly one of Jackson's attorneys, managed to slip him a gun. He used it to take over San Quentin's internal detention block. As he did, witnesses later reported, he repeatedly shouted, "The dragon has come." 6 guards and 2 white prisoners were taken hostage. 5 were later found dead in Jackson's cell, their throats slit. Jackson later bolted into the prison yard, where snipers immediately killed him with a single shot to the middle of his back. 6 men were dead. It was the bloodiest day in the history of the California prison system. In a split second, George Jackson went from messiah to martyr. 2,000 attended his funeral at a church in Oakland. During the services, the Weather Underground detonated bombs in protest, one in San Francisco, the incident Marvin Doyle wrote about, and a second in Sacramento. At San Quentin, officials so feared a violent reaction that they prepared for an armed invasion of the prison. In the end, not much happened. But although he was quickly forgotten by mainstream America, the memory of George Jackson and his brother would inspire several underground groups in the next few years, the last of which would not be broken up until 13 years later, in 1984. There are Bay Area radicals who hang George Jackson's picture in honor to this day. Jackson's final literary offering, Blood in My Eye, was published 6 months after his death in February 1972. It is an amazing document, a straightforward call for a bloody, black-led revolution in the streets of America, and a vivid testimony to how thoroughly he had internalized everything he had read in DeBry and other revolutionary sources. Jackson had written much of it while written in solitary, grieving for his brother, and later friends would come forward to say how totally he had lost touch with reality there. Jackson wrote, "We must accept the eventuality of bringing the USA to its knees, accept the closing off of critical sections of the city with barbed wire, armored pig carriers crisscrossing the streets, soldiers everywhere, Tommy guns pointed at stomach level, smoke curling black against the daylight sky, the smell of cordite, house-to-house searches, doors being kicked in, the commonness of death." Blood in My Eye was largely dismissed by critics. The Times reviewer said it suffered from slapdash urgency and lacks the visceral brilliance, the epistolary panache of Jackson's first book. It was avidly read, however, by prison revolutionaries, especially in California, where it was viewed as a messiah's final call to arms. Among its most passionate readers was a slender, soft-spoken inmate at the California Medical Facility at Vacaville, the state prison system's psychiatric treatment center, an hour north of San Francisco. His name was Donald DeFries. I mean, of course, again, with these euphemistic terms, the California Medical Facility, which is basically an asylum.
Well, you got to paint it all nice.
Yeah.
But also, this is a long setup to get to the founder of the Symbionese Liberation Army, or whatever it's called. Yeah. SLA.
This is one of the things that Brian Burroughs could be simultaneously criticized for, but also
I mean, I think it's important
for
narrative's sake. I'm just noticing that for us to get to the SLA, we went through about 7 pages. I mean, it's good stuff. I'm just saying it's taken us 40 minutes to get there. But also, like, do you not think that the California? I understand this is in the throes of civil rights euphoria, but also you would think that as a prison system that you have to limit literature. Every counter-revolutionary force in the world has always limited access to literature to any degree of success. I mean, even Metternich had always had a specific limitation for political pamphlets and how many pages. He always focused on the shorter stuff. I find it kind of interesting that at no point in time did the California Prison Bureau be like, maybe we should stop these fuckers from reading.
Well, it's funny because people say that, oh, books don't matter and that sort of thing, but they do matter.
Clearly.
And you know, like I say that ideas do matter, and the spread of information and ideas is a critical one. And this is why every regime in history has always attempted to limit the spread of information that is hostile to it. It is why every single revolutionary movement has always used every single propaganda mechanism and tool at its disposal to spread its message and to evangelize. And there's a reason for that. And ideas do matter. And if you present ideas consistently over time, you will get figures who are down and out, right? Who believe this stuff. And I think this is probably an extreme limitation of our current system. And just look at I think the left probably had to fight for this before, because I would imagine that at some previous point in history, literature in prison was restricted. And I think there was probably some sort of prison literacy program, and that's how a lot of this stuff might have gotten in. And I would imagine that was probably sometime in the 50s, if I'm not getting the timing wrong here. And the other thing is, like, think of how, like, every single prison now has, like, television stuff now, like, especially the not really the like the maximum security stuff. Those people aren't going to get TV, but there are other prisons, and I remember this because it was a famous case about 10 or 15 years ago where the prisoners were essentially, like, suing for the ability to watch TV, right? Which is just completely ridiculous, but you get the point. Like, oh, we want access to information.
I mean, a lot of the reasoning for this is going to be so that they can distribute literature and have opportunities to prepare their own legal defense pro se. It's just, again, I think when you're dealing with severe exigent circumstances, that you need to be just as harsh, if not just absolutely totalitarian.
Right. And to be fair to Burroughs here, in his defense, he does tend to make these little introductory chapters for the story arc. So this is just what he does. He usually splits these stories up into a couple sections. He doesn't tell it all in one chapter. And yeah, he did that with Weather Underground and that stuff too. The actual BLA, the original BLA. Vingel says, you know what's funny? Cordite hasn't been used in ammunition for over 100 years, but people still talk about the smell of cordite as a literary device. Well, Vingel, that's because it goes hard. that's the cordite just sounds like some combustible substance, right? It has these connotations. So, of course they're going to use it. Anyway, moving on. Of the hundreds of self-styled revolutionaries in the California prison system, Donald DeFreeze was among the least likely to lead an underground army. He was neither a charismatic leader like George Jackson, nor a gifted writer like Eldridge Cleaver, nor physically intimidating. He hadn't even done time in a brutal prestige facility like San Quentin. Behind prison walls, he was never a leader. In the real world, he was scarcely remembered at all. But he was a well-read black prisoner, and for the impressionable white radicals he would eventually take underground, that was enough. Yeah, he has a bit of a black privilege here, I would say.
He's such a well-spoken black guy.
Such a well-spoken, articulate.
Speaking of Joe Biden, he's such a well put together black guy.
DeFreeze's story was a sad one. Born in Cleveland in 1943, the eldest of 8 children, he was a bright, sensitive child whose alcoholic father, it was later claimed, regularly beat him, sometimes with a baseball bat or a hammer. I mean, imagine getting beaten with a fucking hammer. Holy shit. After a series of arrests for stealing cars and a gun, he said he wanted to kill his father. DeFreeze, at 14, ran away to Buffalo, New York, where he lived with a cousin and then a Baptist minister who pulled the teenager into his raucous fundamentalist church, an experience that would eventually inform DeFreeze's life underground. Once again, though, he got into trouble and was shipped to a juvenile facility in Elmira for stealing a car. He was released at 18 and washed up alone and aimless in Newark, New Jersey. Yes. There's always a weird evangelistic experience a lot of these guys have. Like if you notice, like Malcolm X has like Islam, and these other black radicals have like obviously a Baptist upbringing, this sort of like fire and brimstone kind of preacher person in their life. These are one of the little patterns I notice amongst this group in particular.
Well, also, like, you have religion, of course, always gets used as a motivating tool for animus. I mean, also to have like some sort of minister do X, Y, and Z. I mean, how many? I mean, black church, and I don't know if it's most likely a black minister. I mean, let's not kid ourselves. So
Right.
I think that, you know, if you were to drive into these areas where these revolutionary groups are going to foment, there's that very revolutionary theology, that kind of what's it called more specifically, like just like radical liberation theology is what's going to emerge in this instance, and it's
Exactly.
not going to go away. And I mean, whether it's Islam, which we see with
It's
Malcolm
liberation
X.
theology. Liberation theology is the term you're looking for.
Yeah,
there.
that's exactly it. It's liberation theology, just top down. And I mean, more importantly, it's also a thing to consider in this respect is that you go to any like black part of town, like any major metropolitan area, from like Chicago to Oklahoma City, it's going to be filled with these kinds of groups and churches advocating for their own particular ethnic grievance. I mean, the actual faith itself is going to be substituted for a particular political agenda.
Mm-hmm. DeFries was a quiet man, 5'9", slender. He often spoke with the hint of an affected Jamaican lilt. Against all odds, he found stability and structure in Newark. He became a house painter, a diligent one, and married an older woman, 23-year-old Gloria Thomas, who had 3 children of her own. They were a mismatched pair. Thomas, you think? Thomas energetic and immaculate, DeFries a sullen loner with wounded eyes. Thomas was every inch a striver, friends recall, and hectored DeFries to make more money. He tried for a time, starting his own interior decoration outfit, the House of DeFries, but it went nowhere. They began to fight. Thomas did most of the hollering, yelling at DeFries as if he were one of her children. He began to withdraw, disappearing at night and sometimes for days at a time. Later, there were stories he had turned to house burglary and armed robbery. He began buying guns, tinkering with them in a basement workshop at their apartment house in East Orange. It was there, on the morning of March 9th, 1965, 2 years into his new life, that the trouble began. Neighbors heard a loud bang, and the building began to fill with smoke. When police arrived, DeFries told them it was just a firecracker. A search revealed an unexploded bomb housed in a bamboo stem, presumably a twin to the one that exploded. DeFries was arrested, then indicted for illegally discharging a firearm. His wife was apoplectic. His landlord evicted them. Just as he had done as a boy, DeFries reacted by running away, this time to Southern California. 3 weeks later, he was arrested while hitchhiking on the San Bernardino Freeway. In his briefcase, officers found a sawed-off shotgun, a sharpened butter knife, and a homemade tear gas bomb. After his release, he returned to Newark, only to be arrested again, carrying a homemade bomb. To this day, no one has a clue what he was up to. He was years away from being a revolutionary. He wasn't remotely political, in fact, and there was never an accusation that he used a bomb in anger. People in Newark, however, suspected the worst. After rumors spread that he was a violent black Muslim, DeFries was unable to secure any more house painting jobs. He convinced his wife they would have a better chance starting over in Los Angeles, and so the family moved to California. There, it would appear, while working intermittently as a short-order cook and a painter, DeFries indulged his interest in guns by moonlighting as a black market gun runner, selling pistols and rifles to street gangs and, it was said, to members of the new Black Panther Party. His home life remained unstable. He drank, disappeared for days. They fought. The family made do on a $370 monthly welfare check. And DeFries' penchant for bizarre arrests continued. In 1967, he was arrested for running a red light on a bicycle. In its basket, officers found a pistol and 2 homemade bombs. DeFries drew probation. That December, he was arrested yet again for carrying an unlicensed pistol. A check revealed that it was one of 200 weapons stolen from a military supply warehouse. DeFries cooperated, offering to lead police to the entire cache. But once arriving at an apartment house, he leaped from a second-story window and escaped. 4 days later, he was recaptured. This time, he dutifully escorted the police to his partner's flat, where they found the guns. Once more, thanks to his cooperation, he drew probation. A court psychologist found DeFries emotionally confused and conflicted with deep-rooted feelings of inadequacy. Afterward, DeFries tried to go straight, taking a course in aircraft assembly, but Lockheed turned him away when they discovered his criminal record. In the summer of 1969, his wife demanded they leave Los Angeles. This time, DeFries chose his hometown, Cleveland, but the family's stay came to an end after only a few months, when DeFries was arrested on the roof of a bank with burglary tools. His wife left him. DeFries returned, alone, to Los Angeles, where his wanderings finally came to an abrupt end a few weeks later, in November 1969. It was then, police said later, that he robbed a woman of a $1,000 cashier's check, tried to cash it in vain, then led officers on a foot chase, firing at them until he ran out of bullets. His probation revoked, he was sent to prison at Vacaville for a minimum of 5 years. It is not clear that a soul in the world cared. Like Malcolm X and Sekou Odinga and Eldridge Cleaver before him, Donald DeFries got something from prison that he had never known. Time to read, time to develop his mind. He started with pornography and men's magazines, but soaking up the revolutionary tenor of California prisons, soon found the book and the man that explained it all. Soledad Brother by George Jackson. Reading Jackson, DeFries was suddenly able to understand his strange jumble of a life. None of it, he discovered, was really his fault. The black man never had a chance. He never had a chance. Moreover, he wasn't really a criminal. He had been fighting for his economic freedom, for his dignity, and a repressive white government had jailed him for it. He was a political prisoner. In time, DeFries branched out, reading the books Jackson recommended. Mao, Lenin, Che, then Fanon and Debray, and the rest. And while he never became entirely conversant in left-wing ideology, he found adventure and excitement and purpose. Marxism even explained his wife. She wasn't a striving harpy, she was just bourgeois. In 1970, not long after DeFries arrived, Vacaville formally approved the charter, for a 2-year-old Black Culture Association. The BCA, as it was known, met 2 nights a week in the prison library, one for informal classes in Black history, literature, and similar topics, the second a social evening, typically with a presentation by a guest speaker, poetry, music, or a film. BCA meetings came wrapped in the full regalia of Black liberation. Each began with clenched fist salutes, a Swahili chant, and the hoisting of a BLA flag. Almost to a man, BCA members adopted African-sounding names that some could never quite learn how to spell. After DeFries joined, he began calling himself Sink Ntume, usually shortened to Sin. With the BCA's help, DeFries, like scores of other inmates, soon lost himself in a world of revolutionary fantasy, imagining that he would escape from prison and lead the urban revolt his idol George Jackson called for. As one of the BCA's white tutors put it, there were inmates at Vacaville who had mapped out the revolution from beginning to end, leaving nothing in between. They knew what time the revolution would start in the morning and what day. They knew how to form a vanguard and how it would split up into cadres from the east and the west and the north and the south. To hear them talk, you would think that they knew exactly how to do away with the system. The guards would hear this shit 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There were people who could quote long passages from Che and Mao and Marx and revolutionaries that I had never heard of. DeFries was Exhibit A of this kind of prisoner, and it was in the BCA that he met many of the white volunteers he would eventually lead underground. He briefly lost touch with these friends, if not his revolutionary dreams, after being transferred to Soledad in December 1972. Then, on the night of March 5th, 1973, As the police in far-off New York swept the streets in search of Joanne Chesimard and the remnants of the BLA, a Soledad guard in a prison truck dropped DeFries off at a collection of boilers at the fence line. It was 12:15 a.m., the first and last shift of DeFries' new job as a boiler attendant. The guard was to check on him through the night, but the moment he drove off, DeFries jogged to the 12-foot-high wire fence, climbed it, tearing his jeans in the process, and dropped to the far side. By the time the guard returned at 12:40, he had vanished into the night. At that moment, DeFries became a free man, an escaped prisoner, and, his fevered mind was convinced, the leader of the bloody revolution that would soon sweep America. 100 miles north, in Berkeley, in San Francisco, in the ghettos of Oakland, vanguard troops were waiting for his command. He knew it. He just had to reach them. In the cold, damp hours before dawn, DeFries walked east to Highway 101, where he flagged down a man driving a Ford pickup who took him 10 miles north to the farming town of Gonzales. This is why you never, ever, 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 ever pick up convicts or hitchhikers in areas where there's a freaking prison. This is why they have prison signs next to those correctional facilities. A Chicano laborer, accepting his explanation that he had been robbed, took DeFries into his home, gave him a bowl of soup, and, after he took a map, allowed him to telephone his friends in the Bay Area left. It was early. Most weren't home. Finally, one, whose identity was never divulged, drove down with a change of clothes and picked up DeFries after lunch. On the drive north, DeFries spoke of the joys of reading Fanon, DeBry, Marighella, Lenin, and others, especially Jackson. With Jackson gone, DeFries remarked the revolution had no leader. It was clear who DeFries thought Jackson's replacement should be. Arriving in Oakland, DeFries took out a list of names, people who had visited him in prison and spoke fervently of the need for a revolutionary alliance of black prisoners and white radicals. Here, however, he got his first sense of the yawning gap between cell block sloganeering and 1973 America. Of the 4 or 5 people he managed to find that first day, not one would take him in. Hide you out? One Berkeley student asked in exasperation. I can't be harboring no convicts. That's cops and robbers shit. Finally, late that night, DeFries...
It really does speak for a moment, just like the difference between the prison revolutionary with nothing to lose in comparison to, like the champagne socialist white liberal. It's just like, I don't have time for this. Are you fucking kidding me? I can't go to jail. Like, my trust fund would evaporate.
Yeah, if I did revolutionary activity, I would get kicked out of grad school. Yeah.
Some things never change.
Right. But it just goes to show you, any successful revolutionary movement requires a hardcore vanguard of people with nothing better to do and nothing to lose. Moving on. Finally, late that night, DeFries' friend dropped him off outside Peking House, a revolutionary commune in Berkeley whose members had volunteered at Vacaville. According to lore, when the door was opened, DeFries' first words were, "Look a-here, I'm here. Let's start the revolution." A friend of a friend allowed DeFries to sleep in her apartment that first night. It was on the second night that Donald DeFries, soon to anoint himself General Field Marshal Cinque of the Symbionese Liberation Army, found his way into the bed of his first recruit, an attractive 22-year-old pharmacist's daughter named Patricia Soltysik. Funny name. Her family called her Pat.
It's Polish.
It's Polish? Okay.
Yeah. I looked it up.
You can't tell with some of these people.
Oh, I mean, I get that, but yeah. Polish woman, I think, born in California.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, obviously she's from California, but yes. I want to see a picture of her if I can get one. Be interested to see.
Up. She's up there.
Yeah. Can't tell if she's cute or not.
No, not really.
I mean, cute for leftist circles, I suppose, but like to Antifa types, but yeah, okay, yeah. Well, you can go look. What's so funny?
We're just looking her up for attraction's sake.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he claims that she was attractive, so I mean, I guess she has a decent smile, I guess, but yeah,
she's got a great revolutionary personality.
Right. I mean, yeah, she looks cute for the proletariat. Anyway, so this chick, Patricia Soltysik, who was nicknamed Ms. Moon, she was a sometime Berkeley student, a sometime lesbian, and a self-avowed revolutionary feminist. She was also a janitor. When she wasn't mopping floors, Soltysik would become DeFreeze's partner in their revolutionary assault on America. In those early days, with no one looking that hard for DeFreeze, the two were free to drift through the bizarre bazaar that was 1973 Berkeley, a college town deep in a post-1960s intellectual hangover, a haven for aging radicals who would still talk eagerly about the coming revolution, but no longer had the energy to do much about it. Berkeley's free speech movement had helped launch the movement, capital M, in 1964, but its best and brightest had long since moved on to other causes. In their absence, the calls for revolution had fallen to the wayward souls who still flocked to Berkeley from across the country. The street preachers, the deluded, the lost. The Bay Area left remained as vital as ever, still teeming with radicals devoted to every conceivable cause. But those who clung to the ideas of armed struggle and the viability of an underground now ran less into the brainy Ivy Leaguers of the Weather Underground than to the escaped convicts, janitors, runaways, and angry lesbians who would eventually, under DeFreeze's leadership, become the Symbionese Liberation Army. America had changed that much in 3 short years. In 1970, those who called for violent revolution were viewed, as many, as an intellectual vanguard. In 1973, they were widely dismissed as lunatics. Berkeley was probably the only place the SLA could have been born. It was among the few enclaves left in the United States where the notion of armed struggle was taken even the slightest bit seriously. A dozen or so fly-speck underground groups were scattered through the hills around town. About the only people who heard their calls for revolution were those sitting next to them on the couch. A few, however, tried to mount isolated actions. During DeFreeze's time in Berkeley, members of a radical commune called the Tribal Thumb Collective were arrested for a bank robbery. Police tied another group, the August 7th Guerrilla Movement, to a series of murders and a bizarre incident in which a cab driver was briefly kidnapped. The ransom note demanded that Bay Area cabbies go on strike to force the release of radical convicts. This type of violence was woven deeply into the fabric of the Bay Area in 1973. San Francisco's mysterious Zodiac killer was still at large. The SLA's exploits would parallel a series of 14 Bay Area murders by a small group of black militants dubbed the Zebra Killers. In this environment, DeFreeze and Ms. Moon had little trouble gathering a guerrilla cell of their own.
As a pause real quick, like the small group of black militants, the Zebra Killers, all of those guys just explicitly killed white people. If the name didn't give that away, their numbers are debated in terms of how many were done. It was 4 black murderers, but I think that while there's 15 confirmed, there's probably more, about 75 that were part of it, and they all got life sentences. But yeah, it's important to keep in mind, like, the radical revolutionary language you hear from people from like BLM and the rest has been echoed for 50 to 60 years, and they were far more open about just trying to kill you.
Yes. Clearly. In this environment, DeFreeze and Ms. Moon had little trouble gathering a guerrilla cell of their own, including a former lover of hers and DeFreeze's friends from the Vacaville BCA. Most of their recruits were in their 20s and active in the prison movement. A few had worked with Venceremos. All believed that, with the help of black prisoners, they could use U.S. ghettos to launch the kind of urban warfare that their hero George Jackson had prophesied. Eventually, they would number 8, and he's got them listed here. Nancy Ling Perry Faheza. Tiny, barely 4'11", the daughter of conservative parents, Perry grew up in Santa Rosa, California, and earned an English degree at Berkeley in 1970. A heavy drug user, reeling from a broken marriage, she was selling juice from a gypsy cart on campus when she was drawn into the SLA. I mean, well, that's what happens when you go to Berkeley to get an English degree. You end up a leftist. Willie Wolfe, Cujo. Sorry. It's the name of that dog in what is it? That baseball movie, that children's baseball movie. I forget the name of it now. Anyway, raised in Connecticut.
Isn't Cujo a Stephen King novel?
Yeah, I think it is actually. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Oh, yeah. It's a Stephen King novel. Why am I making a connection to a movie? I don't know. Anyway, so raised in Connecticut, the son of a wealthy doctor, Wolfe graduated from a Massachusetts boarding school before drifting west to enroll at Berkeley in 1971. Quiet but committed, he lived for a time at Peking House and spent every free hour working with inmates at Vacaville. I mean, where do you think Stephen King got the name from? I wonder. The inspiration, anyway.
Yeah.
Camilla Hall, a.k.a. Gabby, originally from Minnesota, Hall, a heavy-set lesbian with short blonde hair and thick glasses, arrived in Berkeley in 1971, taking an apartment on Channing Way. Ms. Moon was her upstairs neighbor. They had been lovers. Russell Little, Osceola, a University of Florida dropout, Little washed up in Berkeley in 1972, roaming with his best friend, Willie Wolfe, at Peking House. Drawn into the Vacaville BCA to search out the revolutionaries, political prisoners, and prisoners of war, he became convinced that underground warfare was still tenable, that groups like Weather had failed in large part because they were afraid to take lives. Joseph Ramiro, or Bo. Ramiro was the ultimate angry Vietnam veteran, a hyperactive, hot-headed former infantryman who returned to the United States determined to strike back at the government that sent him overseas. He spent much of his time holding weapons classes for Bay Area radicals. When Little and Wolfe left Peking House, they moved in with Ramiro. Bill Harris, a.k.a. General Takeo. The oldest of the recruits at 28, Harris was another Vietnam veteran. After returning and earning a master's degree in urban education at the University of Indiana, he moved to Oakland in 1972 in search of a teaching job. A heavy LSD user, Harris ended up sorting mail at the Berkeley post office and spent his spare time volunteering with black prisoners at the Vacaville BCA. I mean, imagine getting a master's degree and then having to fucking sort mail. Ugh. Emily Harris, Yolanda. Married to Bill, Emily was a peppy Chi Omega at Indiana University until falling for Harris and internalizing his radical politics. She worked as a typist at Berkeley. I mean, there you go. This is just who women want to have sex with. And lastly, Angela Atwood, or General Galena. A flamboyant young actress from the New Jersey suburbs, Atwood met the Harrises while studying theater at Indiana. She joined the couple in Oakland and, between roles in local plays, worked as a waitress at the Great Electric Underground restaurant. When her marriage broke up in 1973, she moved into the Harrises' spare bedroom. All right, now we've gotten through all of that, we can actually proceed back to the story. Thank you, Burroughs. This chapter is actually not that much. There's not that much left to it. There's only more couple pages, but
yeah, but still, it's important. You got to get the bios down.
Right. As I said, this is a bit of an introductory chapter for the SLA, but pieced together from the most committed of those at Peking House and their friends, this group came together in fits and starts during the mid-1973 timeframe. Gathering momentum once DeFreeze and Ms. Moon moved into an apartment on East 17th Street in a ghetto section of Oakland that June. Nancy Perry was the first to join, bringing along Willie Wolfe and his pals Russ Little and the angry Joe Ramiro. Before DeFreeze appeared, the four, all BCA volunteers, had formed a nascent underground cell of their own with prisoners at Vacaville. The Partisans' vanguard party, however, existed only in their minds. These recruits found DeFreeze brimming with ideas for a revolutionary army. He and Ms. Moon had been scribbling organizational charts and rules for weeks. From the beginning, there was a surreal quality to the aborning SLA, an exaggerated sense of diluted grandiosity, of play-acting. De Vries envisioned not only a Symbionese liberation army, Symbionese was derived from the word symbiosis, but a Symbionese federated republic, a court of the people, and units labeled mobility, medical, provision, and communication. The SLA's ideology, however, was even hazier than its imagined structure. It sought to abolish prisons, marriage, and rent while attacking racism, sexism, ageism, capitalism, fascism, individualism, possessiveness, competitiveness, and all other institutions that have made and sustained capitalism. Man, these guys are a broken record, aren't they? In practice, De Vries...
You're telling me, man.
Speaking to the choir here.
Preaching to the choir, it's the Jimmy Neutron bit where it's just like, this is the 7th time you've presented like radical Marxist left stuff to show and tell there. It's frustrating. Sandlot.
Yeah, thank you, Bunko Man, for that. I've never seen that movie, but I knew it was from something. But yes, The Sandlot. All right, moving on. In practice, De Vries and his acolytes did their best to mimic routines pioneered by Weather, the calisthenics, the weapons training, the study of Marxist texts, and even the grueling self-crit. But all of it was in service to a worldview that veered between comical and truly insane, where Weather's leadership now called itself the Central Committee. It always calls themselves the Central Committee, don't they? De Vries styled himself General Field Marshal Cinque. He's got the pronunciation written in text. Cinque. Where Weather took banal code names, Jack, Molly, Mike, the SLA chose monikers out of some imagined African revolution. Fahiza, Cujo, Teiko. Where Weather's communiques alternated between hippie jargon and sober Marxism, the SLAs would arrive unmoored from all reality, a notion enshrined by its favored salutation, a line that sounded as if uttered by a villain in a 1930s-era Buck Rogers serial. Death to the fascist insect that preys upon the life of the people! It's entirely possible that the SLA would have remained just a fixture of Donald De Vries's fevered imagination if not for the sudden arrival of yet another escaped prisoner, this one from Vacaville in August. His name was Theo Wheeler. Wheeler was a friend of De Vries's and an inmate leader, every bit as revolutionary-minded, but a tad more level-headed. When Wheeler was brought to a rendezvous in Palo Alto, he was surprised to see De Vries waiting. He had no idea that his old pal had helped arrange the escape. Wheeler and his girlfriend, a young heiress and Venceremos associate named Mary Alice Syme, began hanging out with Ms. Moon and Nancy Perry. There, Wheeler told reporters months later, De Vries eagerly brought out a notebook adorned with the SLA's symbol, a 7-headed cobra, in which he had scribbled detailed organizational and battle plans for his new underground army. He handed me this book, with all these cobras on the cover, Wheeler remembered. He asked me to read it. I did, and I thought, man, this is really shit. I told him it was a bunch of garbage. It wasn't realistic as far as revolution was concerned. Actually, it was bullshit. It was suicide. I mean, is that what their symbol is supposed to be, a 7-headed cobra? I thought it just looked like a shitty splotch of ink or something.
So if you read, so you can go on the Office of Justice Programs of the DOJ website, and you can read the principles that he wrote down. So, I mean, it is a 7-headed cobra with, names and, well, actually not names, but just like these African writings for what these things mean for unity, faith, creativity, collective work and responsibility, cooperative production, self-determination. And you can read the whole thing, and you can see how she might want to assume it's suicide.
Yeah. Anyway, let's see. De Vries was crestfallen but undeterred. He needed Wheeler badly because Wheeler had the contacts to Venceremos, to the Black Panthers, to people who could sell them guns. That he didn't. DeFries was uncomfortably aware that, other than the 9 recruits he had fielded so far, some still of uncertain loyalty, not a single other radical group they had approached had shown the slightest interest in joining forces with them. He pressed ahead nonetheless. They stole weapons, burglarizing the homes of leftists they knew. Up in the Berkeley Hills, Joe Romero showed them how to fire the guns. He taught them karate, too. All through the fall, they debated their first action, an attack on an Avis rental car office for supporting the fascist governments of Portugal, Israel, and others. A draft communique explained, was planned but then postponed, as was an assassination of the director of the California prison system, Raymond Procunier. Finally, one evening in October, Theo Wheeler launched into a rant about Marcus Foster, the superintendent of the Oakland school system. Foster, the city's first black school administrator, was a nationally respected figure, but he had angered the Black Panthers and other radical groups by suggesting that police be brought in to curb school violence and by proposing that students carry identification cards. I mean, this is in the days before they had student ID. Holy shit.
You had student IDs back then, but still. I mean, it's just illustration of how bad things are getting.
Right. It's the implication that at one point there was not such a thing as student ID. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or that they didn't have to carry them. In Wheeler's mind, this amounted to a fascist plot against black youth. DeFries listened, then leaned forward, and in a tone that halted any further discussion breathed, "That nigger is gonna die." The unofficial birth of the Symbionese Liberation Army came on November 6, 1973, just 8 days before the killing of Twyman Myers and the unofficial death of the BLA. No one would ever be entirely sure who the participants were. According to most accounts, it was DeFries, Ms. Moon, and little Nancy Perry. Whoever it was, they were in a place a few minutes after 7 that dark, chilly evening. They were in place a few minutes after 7, I should say. 2 of them in the parking lot of the Oakland Board of Education, leaning against a wall. A third was crouched in nearby foliage. Just then, 2 men emerged from the building. The first, a deputy superintendent named Robert Blackburn, glanced at the pair in the shadows as he passed, his car keys already in his hand. His best friend, Marcus Foster, the superintendent Oakland had hired away from Philadelphia, was walking just a few steps behind him when the first shots rang out. Blackburn whirled around just in time to see the muzzle flashes as the 2 figures behind him began firing into Foster. There was an explosion, and Blackburn felt a searing pain in his back, a load of buckshot fired from the bushes. He lurched forward just as a second blast struck him in a glancing blow. Blackburn staggered, nearly falling, before stumbling almost 60 feet to an outside door. Instead, he slumped to the floor and shouted, "Help! Get help!" Police were on the scene within minutes. They found a group of school officials standing over Foster's dead body. Blackburn, taken to the hospital, survived. The shooters had vanished, but detectives found footprints in the bushes and bullet casings. When they examined a spent slug, they noticed something odd. The tip had been drilled out. Chemists would later discover that each of the bullets fired at Foster that night had been filled with potassium cyanide. The superintendent had been shot to pieces. 5 bullets fired into his back, 2 more in the front, the last hitting him in the leg. The Symbionese Liberation Army's war against the United States had begun, but the reaction to its first attack was not at all what DeFries had expected. Far from drawing cheers from Bay Area radical groups, Foster's assassination provoked near universal condemnation. Black leaders denounced the murder of one of their own. Thousands would turn out to attend one of the 3 memorial services. The Panthers decried the brutal and senseless murder, and initially suggested that powerful fascist elements were behind it. Yes, the hidden reactionary, of course. Not until the next day did the strange communique with the 7-headed cobra arrive at a Berkeley radio station, KPFA. It was from the Symbionese Liberation Army Western Regional Youth Unit, and it explained Foster's murder was the result of his fascist student identification program. To those who would bear the hopes and future of our people, it read in part, let the voice of their guns express the words of freedom. Public reaction to the strange communique was muted. In the Bay Area, the SLA missive was viewed as yet another bizarre message from yet another bizarre group no one had heard of. The most notable reaction was a yawning silence from the radical left, especially from the prisons, the one place from which DeFries might have expected to hear voices of support. Instead, nothing. The fact was, even for those who still espoused revolution, the assassination of a black leader seemed incomprehensible. Months later, when the SLA became a focus of national interest, the prevailing view of Foster's murder was voiced none other by Bernardine Dorn, who issued a statement from the safety of her bungalow in Hermosa Beach. We do not comprehend the execution of Marcus Foster, she wrote, and respond very soberly to the death of a black person who is not a recognized enemy of the people. The following week, after the Oakland school system suspended the ID program to reassess community and student feelings, the SLA issued a second communique defending itself, mentioning Foster's one-time membership on the Philadelphia Crime Commission. The forces... were you about to say something?
Oh, no, I mean, it is, like you mentioned earlier, it's the hidden reactionary, it's the looking for anything, and all the other leftists are just like, dude, come on. Like optics, man, you can't kill a black guy. And
Right.
there's the irony in this little section here is palpable.
Indeed. The forces of the Symbionese Liberation Army remind the enemy rich ruling class that the people will always understand the effectiveness and tactics of revolutionary justice, and will never be deceived by the distortions and lies of the fascist news media. Marcus Foster has been likened to one of our slain leaders. We ask, who ever heard of a Martin Luther King on the Philadelphia Crime Commission? We are well aware the fascist news media seeks to condition us by repressing the truth. Oh, gosh, these guys. The manhunt for Foster's killers prompted immediate changes in the SLA. Theo Wheeler, wanting no part of a murder rap, fled. DeFries, however, only redoubled his preparations for war. Along with Ms. Moon, he and most of the others moved into a house in suburban Clayton, just north of Berkeley, where they introduced themselves to neighbors as the Devoto family. Behind nailed-down shutters and window shades, they spent their days in a furious routine of calisthenics, weapons training, bomb building, and writing. They wrote at least 10 separate communiques, each intended to be a public explanation of a bombing of some multinational corporation or the assassination of one of its executives. The targets included companies such as ITT, Bank of America, and General Tire. The other members, including the Harrises and Angela Atwood, were frequent visitors. For the moment, at least, they were able to operate safely and secretly at the Clayton house. As yet, the police had no clue who the SLA was, much less where it was hiding. Then, suddenly, came the moment that changed everything. On the night of January 10th, 1974, a policeman in the adjoining suburb of Concord, David Douge, spied a van moving slowly down a residential street. Thinking it might be burglars casing the neighborhood, he pulled it over. Inside were Joe Ramiro and Russ Little. They said they were lost, which was true. A check of their driver's licenses came back clean. But something about the pair struck Douge as suspicious. When he asked Ramiro to step out of the car, he saw the bulge beneath his untucked shirt. Their eyes met. Ramiro went for his gun. Officer Douge ducked behind his cruiser. When he stuck his head out, Ramiro fired 2 shots. Douge fired 2 back. After a second exchange of fire, Ramiro sprinted into the darkness. With a squeal of tires, Russ Little drove off in the van. After Douge radioed for help, a second cruiser arrived. They had just driven forward a single block when, to their amazement, they saw the van driving back toward them. Little, guessing that police would follow his trail, had circled back. The officers leapt from their cars and pointed guns at the van. Little emerged, hands held high. Police swarmed to the area in search of Joe Ramiro. Finally, just before dawn, an officer saw someone dart between two houses just a few blocks from the shooting site. When a second officer arrived, they walked up a darkened driveway, one officer loudly pumping a shell into the chamber of a shotgun. From the darkness, someone called out, "I've had it. I give up." Ramiro was led away in handcuffs. By sunrise, yeah, you can start reading if you would like.
Yeah, sure. By sunrise, no one in the police ranks had yet any sense that Ramiro and Little were part of the SLA, much less that DeFries and three others were living barely 2 blocks away. As luck would have it, the SLA learned of the arrests before the police learned of their whereabouts. At 6:15 that evening, neighbors saw a Buick Riviera wheel out of the DeVoto family's sloping driveway, moving so fast that its undercarriage struck the pavement with a whomp. Before leaving, DeFries and the others had drenched the home with gasoline and gunpowder, lit a fuse, and ran. The conflagration they had planned, however, didn't come off, since there wasn't enough oxygen in the enclosed house, and when the fire truck appeared, the blaze was quickly put out. How convenient, how lucky. The firemen saw everything: 2 gunpowder bombs, an aerosol can bomb, not to mention the thousands of pages of loose paper and notebooks, the plans, the charts, the communiques, their research that laid out the who, the what, the when, where, and how of everything the SLA had been doing. The SLA was gone. The Harrises and Angela Atwood disappeared that same day. But the police now had a clear idea of what and who they were up against. They might have learned much more had anyone bothered to study a green spiral notebook found at the house. It was adorned with Nancy Perry's tiny handwriting. One page was a numbered list of subjects she had planned to research at the library. They included the Touche Ross accounting firm, the University of California Board of Regents, the Bank of America. Only later would police realize the significance of the number 1 item that read, "That daughter of Hearst."
Yes, and that is the end of the chapter. And the next chapter is Patty being kidnapped. It's literally called Patty Has Been Kidnapped. Well, that is the end of the chapter, folks. So thank you, Mr. Prudentialist, for coming on. I greatly appreciate your appearance here. We will have to do this again at some point soon. The next chapter is a little bit more exciting, and the chapter after that is interesting as well, because that is the story arc specifically of Patty Hearst and how she becomes a radical militant herself.
Yeah, this is a great chapter. This is where it gets exciting.
Indeed.
But for anyone who wants to read the book, you can look it up on LibGen, on Library Genesis. You can get the whole PDF for free. Highly recommend that you do. I will post it on my Telegram page as well for people who want to download it. But yeah, no, this is a great book. It's an important text. I can't believe it's only 10 years old. But it's a really well-documented history.
Excellent. Yes, do go check it out, folks. It's a good work to have. It's a good work to download and to make sure you have physical copies of things and thumbnail copies of things on your hard drive or your little thumbnail USB port. Anyway, with that, thanks for stopping by, everybody. As per usual, you can show up on my Substack, or you can check out the rest of my YouTube stuff. My monetization path is through Buy Me a Coffee, as well as through my Substack subscriptions. I just recently brought out an article from behind the paywall on my Substack. That is going to be the new monetization pathway. I'll put things behind the paywall for a week, and then I'll bring it out after that. So I have a new podcast out on the Dark Crystal with Hitman. So, Mr. Prudentialist, would you have anything that you would like to share, sir?
I will be live later this evening with my regular co-host, Gio Panichetti, on my channel for the Digital Archipelago. I will have a new episode of Stalin's War out next week after I finish editing some audio on my end for that. And then I'll be hopefully scheduling some time with Dimes for our ongoing book series, Do You Even Read? And we'll be covering On Resistance to Evil by Force. So a lot of books coming in, a lot of the regular shows coming in, and then some stuff on Substack as always. And Mr. Mandrill and I both regularly write for the Old Glory Club Substack, as well as the fact that we're both founding members of the organization. So if you are interested in wanting to know more about what we do at the OGC, be sure and follow us and follow the OGC.
Yes, and if you want to get in touch with the OGC, do be sure to go check out the Old Glory Club's website. You can Google it, theoldgloryclub.com or .org. Yes, get in touch by sending us an email and find like-minded friends. It is not enough to be an isolated, animated individual. That is where you are weak and vulnerable. Do become stronger and actually become part of something real and find like-minded friends, and don't be a loner. So yes, do go do all of that. And with that, that concludes today's stream.